Hello, and welcome to our webinar, SAS, Versatility in the Data Center. My name is Rick Kutzapel. I'm a product planner within Broadcom, and I'm speaking today on behalf of the SCSI Trade Association. And joining me today, I have John Chen and Don Jeanette, both from Trend Focus. Today, John and I are going to talk about some of the trends happening within storage that are creating tailwinds for SAS media in the data center. I will take a run at introducing them and talk about some of the business drivers and underlying technology focusing on some of the innovations in SAS. And then John will add color with a market update. Oh, and yes, so before I begin, a few housekeeping items. I believe everybody's phone will be on mute. If you do have questions, feel free to type them in the selected dialog box, and we will address those at the end of our presentation. So first I wanted to start by reminding everybody that most of today's data centers run on top of a SAS infrastructure. The flexibility of SAS enables it not only to communicate with SAS traditional SAS HDDs and high-performance SAS SSDs, but also a wide variety of devices including SATA HDDs, SATA SSDs, nearline drives, and even tape. This, of course, doesn't include direct attach or chip attach SATA, because there are architectures that focus on that, but it does include all of the large-scale cool and cold data tubs. Today, the majority of these SAS-enabled data centers rely on SATA HDDs. So why is that? And it's basically pure economics. When these architectures were chosen, SATA HDDs were being driven by the scale of client economics, and they were significantly cheaper than enterprise HDDs. And that brings me to my first tailwind. The cost delta between SAS and SATA HDDs has been narrowing and will continue. Right, so remember only 8 years ago or so, there were the gap between these drives was so big that there were dedicated products to intercept that, right? Whether it was the active mux, the SAS SATA bridge, right, to enable a SATA drive to look like a SAS drive. This trend of compressing between the two is being fueled by a number of factors: maturity of HDD technology and the introduction of nearline drives. The second tailwind that I wanted to talk about revolves around the state of SATA just in general. You know, let's remember that SATA was originally defined as a client technology and does have feature function deficiencies relative to the enterprise or the data center. Some quick examples that come to mind are queue depth limitations, for instance. Right, SATA has a limit of 32, while SAS has an architectural limit of 64K. While the typical deployments are, down in the 256, 512 range. SATA does not have the notion of multiple LUNs, and this could become important in future HDD technologies. Also, as a client technology, SATA is inherently less reliable than SAS. In the scale of a modern data center, which can be massive, this can be significant and needs to be accounted for in metrics like total cost of ownership and things like that, so it can't be underestimated. From a spec perspective, at the physical layer, SATA has been capped at 6 gig, and that's been the case for quite some time. Since this time, there have been significant innovations that have taken place in the protocol, such as SMR, logical depop, so SATA has been responsible for those, but the level of innovation has been declining rapidly, and all of these have been then rolled into SAS. Another business-related trend is the rapid adoption of NVMe in the client. While this discussion is not focused on the client, it's focused on the enterprise and the data center. This market shift within the client is relevant to the data center in light of the economies of scale that the client brings with it. This brings me to my last innovation, and that is on the SAS innovation pipeline. SAS has been innovating for quite a few number of years, and nothing has slowed down. And right now we're moving into 24 gig, and many of these innovations are now beginning to come to light. And so for a quick discussion, I broke it up into two pieces. There's the physical layer enhancements and the protocol layer enhancements. On the physical layer side, the easiest one to see is the apparent doubling of the data rate going from 12 gig to 24 gig. We've implemented a more efficient encoding scheme, moving from 8B, 10B to 128, 130. We've added 20 bits of forward error correction to address very difficult, challenging channels, especially in light of the speed bump to 24 gig. We have enhanced our transmitter training algorithm, where we used to train at the start of day, where we would set the SerDes settings at the start of day. With this new transmitter training algorithm, we train on continuous live data in a non-destructive fashion, so that we always have the optimal SerDes settings at any given time. From a protocol perspective, we've implemented the notion of fairness to ensure consistent performance, especially in large, complex topologies like you would find in a data center. You can imagine mixing 6 gig SATA drives with 24 gig SAS drives, for instance, right? And fairness is very important in those types of topologies. Storage intelligence. Storage intelligence is a bucket where I group different innovations around non-volatile memory, solid-state memory, things like streams, background garbage collection, etc. And we also have persistent connections. Persistent connections is where we can open a connection to, for instance, a very high-performance SSD and leave the connection open, so it eliminates the overhead of all the opens and closes associated with the SAS protocol. And then finally, SMP priorities. Storage management cannot be underestimated in large data center-like topologies. And what SMP priorities does is it gives priorities to the management class communications within the topology to make sure that that environment is running soundly. And this is all the management capabilities are all part of and inherent in the SAS technology. Then I wanted to show our technology SAS roadmap real quickly. Of course, we started at 3 gigabit per second, and now we're all the way up to 12 gig SAS, where we're in full production, and things are very strong in 12 gig. And like I mentioned earlier, right now we have sample silicon in-house. There's a lot of testing going on, a lot of interoperability. And we're looking at a plug fest later in 2019, and then production will follow after that. So in summary, data centers and data center architectures continue to evolve, and the technical and business challenges will also continue to grow. While the variables involved in designing and maintaining a modern data center are numerous, there are significant tailwinds driving the growth in SAS technology. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Good afternoon. I'm glad that many of you have joined us today to listen to our webinar and cover some of the points that Rick and I are making regarding SAS. I'm here with Don Jeanette. He and I are both analysts at Trend Focus, and Trend Focus itself is a market research firm that has particularly focused on storage devices, hard drives, SSDs, and the NAND market and the end markets that drive them. Our company has been around for more than 25 years, and we maintain detailed end market models as well as full data sets from all of the individual suppliers of data storage devices to help us build out our models and to do our forecasting work. Those of you who are online and maybe already clients of TrendFocus know that we publish quarterly, and we do quarterly forecasts and 5-year forecasts multiple times per year, and we address numerous elements to storage demand from both the flash and the hard drive side of the market. So let's talk about SAS and the data center, and much of this that is, revolves around what we call nearline hard drives or capacity enterprise. So these are generally 3.5-inch form factor, 7,200 RPM devices, sometimes known as bit buckets, essentially. It is the fastest growing segment of the hard drive market, and some of you may already know that as SSDs begin to penetrate into the client markets, especially as it relates to PCs, the overall HDD market is declining. There are a few segments of the hard drive market that are actually growing over time, and they tend to center around those applications where lowest cost per gigabyte, full random access storage is required, and higher densities are required. So the kind of the tip of the spear, as it would be for hard drives, is in the nearline category. So both from a unit perspective as well as an exabyte or billions of gigabytes per year growth, nearline do represent the fastest growing segment. I'm going to be talking primarily about Q3 data, the specifics there. Obviously, Q4 has finished, and as you know, or some of you may know, the public companies, both Western Digital and Seagate, are announcing their earnings in the next couple of weeks, and we will have their full data at that point to conduct the next quarter's reports and forecasts. So as it relates to Q3 right now, just kind of for perspective, close to 100 million hard drives were shipped in CQ3. Of that, nearline itself is about 14% of the units. So you say, well, 14% is a rather small segment of the market, but you also have to remember that more than 200 exabytes of capacity was shipped in CQ3, and if you look at it from a capacity perspective, nearly half, or 45%, of the total hard drive capacity shipped in that quarter just came from those 14% of units that were nearline. Also, if you look at it from a revenue perspective, despite being a very small percentage of total units, about 37% of total hard drive revenue comes from this category of drives. So once again, it's the most profitable category of drives, the highest ASP category of drives, and it is continuing to grow with time. And what's very interesting about the market overall is that as a total unit TAM declines over time, we're actually finding that the revenue that the industry throws off is relatively flat. And that's really because of the fact that there's this growth of these high capacity, higher ASP drives, but at lower dollars per gigabyte. So we actually are seeing a market that's relatively stable in terms of overall revenue, arguably getting a bit more profitable as it goes forward, despite the fact that the overall market is shrinking. Okay, so also if you start to look at those 14% of hard drive units, you realize that nearline drives can serve a number of purposes. They can ship to traditional OEM IT system makers such as server or external storage array vendors. And then, as you know, in the past decade or so, with the explosion of cloud, especially large tier 1 cloud companies in the US as well as in China, they really are driving the need for higher and higher capacity of what we call nearline storage. So if you look at the total units that ship of total nearline, approximately half of those units ship to what we call hyperscale or cloud applications. So already that's you can see that from a unit TAM consumption, those hyperscale companies really represent, call it, say, a dozen companies consuming nearly half of those nearline hard drives. Now, there's plenty of tier 2s out there as well that's kind of fill in the rest of the cloud market. But of those half of the units, they represent about 2/3 of all nearline capacity. So that's, again, a very, very high mix product. Average capacities for hyperscale or cloud are over 9 terabytes today. The highest capacity mainstream drive shipping in volume today is 12. We're starting to see the emergence of 14 terabytes, but we're already, as an average, the cloud market's already over 9 terabytes. As it relates to SAS, as Rick had mentioned before, SATA has been selected primarily because nearline drives really came out as an offshoot of desktop hard drives or client-based hard drives back in the middle of last decade, and those are primarily SATA-based. And so, based on that SATA to SAS pricing gap that Rick had mentioned before, in general, still most of the nearline drives today are SATA. But right now we're at a point where about 1/4 of all nearline drives are SAS, and a great deal of that percentage really is in the traditional OEM markets that have large SAS infrastructures and backplanes that support direct attach as SAS. Nearline itself, from an exabyte perspective, is growing, as I said, the fastest among all categories of hard drives, and we have it modeled at about 36% compound annual growth. Now that can vary, from year to year, just depending on the scale and the degree of cloud expansion in any given year. For instance, in 2018, we estimate that nearline exabytes grew over 50%. The prior year was somewhere closer to 25%. Most years are kind of in that 30 and 40%. So on average, it's been growing at about 36% compound annual growth. Once again, to kind of talk about the importance of high capacity and how cloud plays into this, this is our 5-year forecast that we published in August. It's another forecast that we will be refreshing here in February. From a unit perspective, you can see steady unit growth. I'd say that the unit growth is in the teens, but as I said before, exabyte growth in the 36% range or so. And you can see a very, very high growth of high capacity drives, and as you can see the different colors moving from 10 terabyte to 12 terabyte to 14 terabyte to 16 terabyte and beyond. Those kind of major transitions that happen every year and a half or so are really related to the availability of new higher capacity hard drives and the transition of the top tier cloud companies moving in high volume to those higher capacity drives. So as it relates overall, half of the units going primarily to hyperscale and cloud. Over time, we probably expect that to grow somewhat. But even the high capacity drives will become very, very important to the OEM market as well, as lowest dollars per terabyte storage really kind of rules the roost, as we say, going forward. So what are the opportunities for SAS and nearline? Once again, from a raw cost perspective, you could argue SATA continues to lead, but the gap is, has declined substantially. In high volume applications, we're seeing SAS and SATA deltas being very, very small nowadays. As I mentioned earlier before, if half of the units are going to OEM, well, for those OEM server and storage vendors, 40% of those are SAS. So as I said before, OEM traditional IT equipment manufacturers are very heavily SAS already. If you look at it from a capacity split, and this is kind of representative of the difference between kind of the mainstream lower capacity OEM use versus the high capacity cloud use, capacity less than or equal to 10 terabytes are currently about 30% SAS, while greater than 10 terabytes, which are primarily consumed by the cloud, are about 15% SAS penetration. So with hyperscale consuming half of all the nearline, and you do the math there, the current SAS penetration in hyperscale is about 10%. Okay, and just to kind of repeat the point, SATA was originally chosen for cost, but really the thing that we think will drive greater opportunities for SAS in data centers is this issue about access density. So for those of you that are not familiar with access density, if you think about a hard drive spinning at, say, 7,200 RPM or whatever RPM you choose, the IOPS, or input outputs per second performance of that drive, are essentially fixed regardless of what the capacity is. So the higher the capacity of the drive, that ratio of IOPS per terabyte, or what was known as access density, continues to decline. So essentially, you get the same input outputs per drive, but on a larger capacity drive that it has to serve larger and larger amounts of data. And the issue becomes that if you have concurrent access from multiple users looking for data on that drive, the probability of multiple accesses to different data sets on that same drive becomes higher and higher. And so the response times tend to become longer, the queue depths become longer. The hard drive industry has tried to address that with larger cache sizes on the drive. They can help somewhat, but I think it's being outpaced by the growth of overall capacity. And then for those cloud and hyperscale companies that are actually controlling their own architectures, their software, their hardware, they're doing a lot of different caching schemes and software schemes in order to manage writes to the drive and reads to the drive, and spreading data around to kind of minimize that situation. But although the access density has always been an issue, even back to the 4 terabyte hard drive days, and that the cloud companies have continued to find workarounds, we're seeing kind of a consistent call across the industry to say, hey, look, once we hit 16 terabytes, we're really starting to see a point where all the tricks of the trade that we've used so far will not help the situation. And so there have been other ideas proposed and also driven by some major cloud companies to address access density. And one of those is this idea of what we call split actuation. So those of you that have been to OCP and have seen other Seagate presentations, Seagate has publicly displayed split actuation drives along with Microsoft. The idea there is that as you have dual actuators on a drive, it acts as essentially like 2 independent hard drives in one box. And so you basically double the performance of that drive from an IOPS per terabyte perspective. And so in that particular case, you really can't leverage SATA interfaces. SAS is required, whether it be single port or dual port. This idea of concurrent access to data on a hard drive from multiple independent actuators really requires SAS. And so for some large cloud companies, that is the direction going forward, that this is probably the best solution despite the additional cost of having a slightly more complex mechanical design in a hard drive. Seems to be the best way to deal with the situation. So, kind of in summary, that idea that, IOPS per terabyte is driving some issues there, the solutions to improve performance really will have, great opportunity for SAS going forward. Now, not every cloud company may go about the same, way of dealing with it by moving to split actuation, but there's definitely lots of opportunity out there, and some large cloud companies that are very serious and committed to doing that move to both split actuation and SAS. So right now, as it stands, SAS penetration at hyperscale at 10%. Even just in as short as 2 years' time, we expect to see that at least double. So you're seeing the fastest growing segment of the HD market growing. You're seeing the fastest growing segment of the fastest growing segment of the hard drive market also growing, and also an acceleration of SAS adoption. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Rick.
Perfect. Thanks, John. That was a great update. And in closing, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining. And in the attachments on the Bright Talk page, you'll see that the slides are attached, as well as a link to the SCSI Trade Association and to Trend Focus. Both great resources of information on this topic and others, of course. And with that, we will conclude. There were no questions from the audience, so I think we're done. Thank you for joining.
Yep, thank you very much for joining.